The smell of her own blood reached her before the pain did. It was copper and salt, thick in the back of her throat, and for one impossible second, Sergeant First Class Claire Novak thought she was back in the Panjshir Valley, back in the dust and the heat and the chaos of a forward operating base that no longer existed. Then the concrete came into focus, cold, wet, the flickering light above her, and the sound of a dog whining. She was not in Afghanistan. She was in the employee parking structure of Hargrove Regional Medical Center in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It was 6 minutes past midnight, and the man who had just put a blade between her ribs was already running. But the dog was still there, and she was still breathing. Barely. 14 years earlier, Claire Novak had enlisted in the Army at 19 with a nursing degree she'd earned in 3 years through sheer stubbornness and a full academic scholarship. She had come from nothing, a double wide outside of Macon, Georgia, a mother who worked 2 jobs and smelled like cafeteria grease, a brother who made bad choices and paid for them slowly. Claire had decided young that the way out was through. Through school. Through service. Through the controlled, purposeful application of everything she had. She had served 2 deployments as a combat medic attached to a special forces group in eastern Afghanistan, then 3 more years in the trauma ward at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, where she stitched together soldiers who had been sent back from places whose names she still couldn't say out loud without feeling something cold move through her chest. By the time she left the Army at 31, she was a walking encyclopedia of catastrophic injury and a deeply private person who kept her feelings folded tight and her professional face on at all times. She had come to Hargrove Regional 4 years ago. It was a Level 2 trauma center, the kind that saw farm accidents and car wrecks and the complicated devastation of soldiers returning from Fort Bragg who couldn't quite find their footing in the world they'd come back to. It was the right place for her. She understood both worlds, the military one and the civilian one, in a way that most people on either side of that divide simply did not. She worked nights. She preferred it. Less administration, more medicine. On the night everything broke open, the shift had started like a dozen other Tuesdays. Cold for October, the parking structure smelling like exhaust and damp pavement, the ER already crackling with the low-grade chaos of flu season and 2 back-to-back motor vehicle accidents. Claire had come in an hour early to cover a colleague whose kid had a fever. She'd done it without being asked. She always did. At 11:42, a call came in from an inbound ambulance. Male patient, late 50s, Marine Corps veteran, acute respiratory distress secondary to a pulmonary embolism. Critical but stable. ETA 8 minutes. What the radio didn't mention, couldn't mention because the paramedics were managing an airway and didn't have a free hand to deal with it, was the dog. He arrived in the back of the ambulance alongside the gurney, a 90-pound German Shepherd named Kodiak, registered service animal, officially tethered to the unconscious man on the stretcher by a worn leather lead. His handler's name was Joseph Renner. Retired gunnery sergeant, USMC, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Helmand. A shrapnel injury that had cost him part of his right lung in 2009 and had been quietly destroying the rest of it ever since. He lived alone in a rented house 8 miles from the hospital and had no emergency contacts listed on file. Kodiak was, for all practical purposes, the only family he had. The ER team swarmed Renner the moment the gurney came through the doors. Claire was already gloved and masked, calling out vitals, adjusting oxygen flow, watching his oxygen saturation with the focused calm of someone who had done this in far worse conditions. But Kodiak would not leave the gurney. He pressed against it, head low, eyes tracking every movement of the medical team with a desperate, laser intensity that made the charge nurse step back. Animal Services, somebody call Animal Services, said the resident on call, a second-year named Doyle who had not yet learned to hide his alarm. He can't be in the trauma bay. He's a service animal, Claire said without looking up. He's registered. And if you try to drag him out of here right now, he's going to take your hand off. So what do we do? Claire looked at Kodiak. The dog looked back at her. She had worked with military working dogs overseas, had spent enough time around them to know the particular quality of intelligence in those eyes. This dog was not aggressive. He was terrified, in the way that only a creature who has never been separated from his person can be terrified. "I'll take him," she said. "I'm due for my break. Give me 20 minutes. She clicked her tongue low and held out the back of her hand. Kodiak sniffed it. Then, with the reluctant, trembling trust of an animal who had no other option, he pressed against her leg and let her lead him out. She took him to the lower level of the parking structure, P2, the employees section, a concrete cavern half empty at this hour, the fluorescent lights buzzing their pale yellow hum. There was a low bench near the stairwell where the nurses sometimes sat to eat. She sat there now. Kodiak's lead looped around her wrist and let the dog put his heavy head on her knee. "He's going to be okay," she said quietly. Not because she knew it was true, because someone needed to say it. Kodiak exhaled through his nose, a long, shuddering breath. He pressed closer. What Claire did not know, could not have known, was that they had been followed. His name was Vince Prater, 44 years old, 3 prior arrests for assault, 1 for breaking and entering, 2 for drug possession. He had been living out of his truck for 6 weeks, working the margins of the hospital neighborhood, a neighborhood full of distracted people, parking structures with minimal security cameras, and a general culture of keep your head down and mind your own business. He had a system. He had been running it successfully for 2 months. He had been watching the ambulance bay from the far end of the parking structure when the dog came in. Had seen the big shepherd, the worn leather harness, the kind of calm obedience that meant expensive, valuable training. He knew what a dog like that was worth. He had sold one before, 3 years ago, to a man in Raleigh he didn't ask too many questions about. The memory of that money was very specific in his mind. He had followed them down the ramp to P2. He was carrying a folding knife and a length of paracord. He hadn't planned anything complicated. He almost never did. Claire heard the footstep at the same moment Kodiak's head came up off her knee. The dog didn't growl. He went absolutely still, every muscle in his body converting from soft to rigid in a single instant, his eyes fixed on the shadow moving at the far end of the row of parked cars. Claire stood. Her hand tightened on the lead. "Hey," she kept her voice flat, professional. "This area is for hospital staff only." Prater stepped into the light. He was taller than she expected, thin in a way that suggested years of poor nutrition and poor choices. His eyes moved from her to the dog and back again with the calculating speed of someone who was used to making quick assessments. The knife was already open in his right hand. Kodiak went low. Not aggressive, evasive. He moved in front of Claire, his shoulder pressing against her shins. "I'm just going to take the dog," Prater said. His voice was almost conversational. "You don't have to make it complicated." Claire had been in 2 firefights. She had held pressure on a femoral artery for 40 minutes in a dust storm while a helicopter took its time arriving. She had worked a code blue in a hallway with no defibrillator and won. Fear, for her, had been processed into something else a long time ago. It had been compressed down and down until it was a small, bright coal at the center of her chest that burned clean and gave off heat and let her think clearly. She thought clearly now. The knife, the distance, the angle of the light. She knew she could not outrun him. She knew that if she let Kodiak go, this man would do something terrible with a dog who had already given more than most people ever would. She knew that if she screamed, the nearest person was 2 floors up. She thought about Renner, unconscious upstairs, about what this dog meant to him. She planted her feet. When Prater lunged forward, not at her, at the dog, slashing toward the leather harness to cut the lead, Claire stepped in front of the blade. The first cut took her across the forearm. It registered as heat more than pain, a searing line that her brain filed under manageable. She grabbed Kodiak's harness with both hands and twisted her body to cover him. Prater's second strike came down on the back of her left shoulder. That one she felt. Her knees buckled slightly. She locked them. "Stop," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Stop right now." He didn't stop. The third came across her ribs, a long dragging cut that meant he was losing precision, panicking slightly, which was both good and very bad. The fourth drove into her side as she turned. She felt the distinct, terrible sensation of something internal giving way. A pressure followed by a spreading warmth that had no business being there. She was going down. She knew it with the same clinical certainty she applied to everything else. As she fell, she yanked the lead free of her wrist and released it. Kodiak, free. It was not a command she'd been taught. It was a guess, a word, spoken with authority, in a voice that said, "This is real and I mean it." It was enough. 90 pounds of German Shepherd hit Vince Prater in the chest with the full velocity commitment of an animal who understood, on some cellular level, that the person who had placed herself between him and danger had just gone down. His jaws closed on Prater's right forearm. The knife clattered on the concrete. Prater screamed, a raw, ragged sound that echoed off the low ceiling of P2 and carried, though neither of them knew it yet, all the way to the stairwell door on the level above. Claire pressed her hand against her side. The warmth was coming faster now. She heard the sound of Prater's footsteps, running uneven, one arm hanging wrong, disappearing up the ramp. Then silence. Then the soft click of Kodiak's nails on concrete as he came back to her. He lay down beside her, his chin on her chest. "Good boy," she said. It came out wet. "Good boy." The stairwell door burst open 40 seconds later. A hospital security guard named Okafor, third shift, ex-Army himself, a man who had been at Hargrove for 11 years and had never run this fast, took the scene in at a glance and was already screaming into his radio before his knees hit the concrete beside her. "I've got a staff member down, P2, stab wounds, multiple. I need a trauma team right now, P2, move." Claire looked up at the concrete ceiling. The fluorescent light above her had a crack in it she'd never noticed before. She thought, in the strange, detached way of someone whose body was making decisions without consulting her brain, that someone should really report that. Kodiak licked her face once. Slow. Deliberate. She closed her eyes. What happened next? She would only learn in fragments, assembled from the accounts of the people who had been there. Okafor's report, the OR nursing notes, the words of her colleague Patrice Webb, who had been first through the stairwell door behind the security team and had not entirely stopped shaking for 2 days afterward. The trauma team reached her in under 4 minutes. Her blood pressure was catastrophic. She had a lacerated spleen, 2 intercostal arteries that required emergency repair, and a punctured bowel that would take a second surgery to fully address. She went into the OR at 12:31 a.m. and did not come out until almost 7 in the morning, and somewhere in that dark stretch of time, at 4:19 to be precise, her heart stopped for 31 seconds before Dr. Anita Chauhan cracked her chest and brought her back by hand. 31 seconds. Patrice told her later that the sound in that OR was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Upstairs, in a private room on the 3rd floor, Gunnery Sergeant Joseph Renner was breathing through supplemental oxygen and a pharmaceutical cocktail that was, very slowly, pulling him back from the edge. At 6:45 a.m., his eyes opened. The first thing he registered was that Kodiak was not beside him. He did not speak. He simply looked at the nurse adjusting his IV. A young man named Torres, who had the misfortune of being the one in the room when Renner woke, with an expression that Torres would later describe as the most politely terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. "My dog," Renner said. Torres swallowed. "Sir, Kodiak is safe. He's with hospital security. He's not injured." "Where?" It was not a question. The word landed in the room like a dropped piece of equipment. Heavy. Final. Torres went to get the charge nurse. The charge nurse went to get the attending. The attending went to get the hospital administrator, a measured, careful man named Garrett Albrecht who had been awake since 2 a.m. and had aged, by his own estimation, approximately 4 years since midnight. Renner listened to the account of what had happened in P2 with his eyes fixed on the acoustic tile of the ceiling above his bed. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly in any way that Torres, who watched from the doorway, could read. When Albrecht finished, Renner was quiet for a moment. "Is she alive?" "She's in post-op," Albrecht said carefully. "She's critical, but she survived the night." Another silence. "The man who did it. The police are looking. He left blood at the scene. The dog bit him badly. They're watching emergency rooms and urgent care facilities in the area. But so far nothing," Renner said. "I understand." He turned his head toward the window. Morning light was pressing against the blinds. "I want to see my dog, and I want to see her." Albrecht started to explain why that was medically inadvisable. Renner's expression stopped him. They brought Kodiak up in a service elevator. The dog walked directly to Renner's bed, pressed his forehead against Renner's hand, and stood very still while Renner ran his fingers through the thick fur at the base of his skull. His hand found dried blood on the dog's muzzle, not Kodiak's. The dog's, Prater's probably, and maybe some of hers. Renner held his breath for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Phone." He made 3 calls. The first lasted 40 seconds. The second lasted under a minute. The third was to a number he had not dialed in nearly 2 years, and it rang only once before a voice he knew, the voice of Master Gunnery Sergeant Dale Corwin, who had served beside him in Fallujah and now ran veteran outreach for the 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune, 90 minutes up the road, answered with his name. "Corwin," Renner said. "I'm at Hargrove Regional in Fayetteville. There's a woman in the ICU." He paused. "She took 4 blades covering Kodiak from a man with a knife. She's one of ours, Dale. She served." He didn't ask for anything specific. He didn't need to. "Give me 24 hours, Corwin said. The line went dead. Renner lowered the phone to his chest and looked at Kodiak. The dog looked back at him with the amber, unreadable eyes of an animal who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. In the 12 hours that followed, a text message moved through a network that had no official name and no formal structure, a web of group chats and encrypted threads and the particular, unbreakable loyalty of men and women who had shared the worst things life offered and come out the other side of it still standing. The message was short. It named Claire Novak. It named what she had done. It named the hospital. Some of the men and women who received it had served with Renner. Some of them had never met him. Some of them had never been to Fayetteville. None of that mattered. What mattered was the geometry of the situation. A veteran's service dog, an attack in the dark, a nurse with a military background who had covered that dog with her own body and paid an almost terminal price for it. The calculus of obligation in that kind of community was swift and clear. By 3 a.m., Prater had been found. He was not found by the police, who were doing their jobs carefully and correctly and would, in time, have gotten there. He was found first by a former reconnaissance Marine named Dobbins, who had 3 civilian friends and a habit of working efficiently. Prater was sheltering in an abandoned commercial space off Bragg Boulevard, his right arm wrapped in a soaked dish towel, cycling through the last of a bottle of vodka and his own panic. He was not difficult to locate. A dog like Kodiak didn't bite, he marked. The wound was catastrophic and distinctive and had left a trail that, to someone trained to read such things, was not subtle. Dobbins called the Fayetteville Police Department from a payphone. He gave them the address. He gave them a description of Prater's current condition, He mentioned that the suspect appeared to be armed with a folding knife that was now in a storm drain on Bragg Boulevard, having been placed there by someone who preferred it not be accessible. He did not give his name. By 4 a.m., Vince Prater was in police custody, his arm being treated at the same hospital where Claire Novak was fighting for her life 4 floors above him. The charge nurse on that floor quietly requested that he be moved to a different facility for continued care. The request was processed with unusual speed. The morning arrived cold and pale over Fayetteville. At 7:15 a.m., Albrecht was in his office on the 4th floor looking at a budget report he was not actually reading when his assistant opened his door without knocking, which she had never done before. "Mr. Albrecht," she said, "you need to come to the window." He came to the window. Below, in the visitor lot and spreading out into the main access road, there were vehicles, trucks and SUVs and a handful of motorcycles with veteran plates, arriving in 1s and 2s and then in a steady, quiet stream, filling the spaces in perfect informal rows. Out of the vehicles came people, men and women in civilian clothes, jeans, boots, jackets, moving with a coordinated, unhurried precision that had nothing to do with a parking lot and everything to do with training. They weren't marching. They were simply moving together in the particular way of people who had spent years learning to move through hard places without wasting anything. They came to a stop in the lot below the ICU windows. 231 people, as the count would later establish. Marines, mostly, from Lejeune and surrounding areas, but also Army veterans from Bragg, a handful of Navy corpsmen, several Special Forces medics who had driven through the night from Charlotte and Raleigh, a contingent of female veterans who had heard about a woman with a combat background and made their own calls. They stood in the cold morning air with their hands at their sides or clasped in front of them. They faced the building. They did not speak. They did not hold signs. They simply stood there in the thin autumn sunlight, and they did not leave. On the 3rd floor, Renner was sitting in a wheelchair by the window with Kodiak on the floor beside him when Corwin wheeled him down to the hallway window that overlooked the lot. Renner looked at the 231 people standing in the cold below the ICU wing. He looked for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "She's going to wake up to this." "That's the idea," Corwin said. In the ICU, the monitors above Claire Novak's bed beeped their steady, careful rhythm through the morning. Her fever had broken at 2 a.m. The post-surgical inflammation in her abdomen was still significant, but no longer worsening. The attending intensivist, a thorough, unsentimental woman named Dr. Challen, who had put her hand inside Claire's chest the night before and physically squeezed her heart back into motion, reviewed the morning labs with the careful optimism of someone who had been wrong in both directions before and preferred to stay in the realm of what was measurable. What was measurable was better. At 11:40 a.m., Claire Novak's eyes opened for the first time in 11 hours. The light was too bright. Everything hurt in a way that was total and consuming, a pain that didn't have specific locations so much as a general premise. The premise being that her body had been through something serious and wanted her to know. Her throat was raw from the ventilator tube that had only recently been removed. Her left arm was heavy with IV lines. There was a sound she couldn't immediately place, rhythmic and low, and it took her a moment to understand it was snoring. She turned her head. Kodiak was lying on the floor beside her bed. He had been there since 6 a.m., allowed into the room by a charge nurse who had looked at the dog, looked at the situation, and decided that the rules were flexible. He was deeply, peacefully asleep, his massive chest rising and falling, completely undone now that the immediate threat had resolved. Something in Claire's chest unlocked. She had been a combat medic. She had been in firefights. She had spent 12 years learning to maintain a functional emotional distance from the things she witnessed. She was not, by any reasonable account, a person who cried easily. She cried now. Quietly. Without moving much because moving hurt. Just her face, doing a thing she hadn't let it do in a long time. while a sleeping dog breathed on the floor beside her. Patrice Webb came in first. She took one look at Claire's open eyes and did something she described afterward as completely unprofessional and absolutely worth it, which was to take Claire's hand in both of hers and stand there for a moment, not saying anything at all. "Renner?" Claire said finally. Her voice was barely there. "Third floor. Stable. He's been asking about you every hour." Patrice smiled. "He's a very intense man." "Kodiak." Claire's eyes moved to the floor. "Right there. He hasn't left." Patrice squeezed her hand. "Claire, there are people outside." Claire frowned slightly. "What people?" Patrice helped her shift enough to see the window. Enough to see what was below. The lot was full. 231 people in the November cold. Still there, still standing. It was almost noon. Some of them had been there since 7 a.m. Someone had brought a thermos of coffee that was moving slowly through the crowd. Nobody had left. Nobody had left. Nobody had been asked to stay. They had simply decided this was where they were going to be. Claire stared. She had spent 11 years in service learning that the most powerful thing was usually the quietest, not the ceremony, not the salute. The thing that happened when people decided, without being told, what something was worth and what they were willing to give for it. She had seen it in operating rooms and helicopter bays and the slow gray hours before a dawn patrol. She recognized it here. These people had come for her. Because she had covered a dog that wasn't hers. Because the dog belonged to someone who mattered to people who didn't forget. She pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. "Tell them," she started and then stopped because she didn't know what to say. She had been briefed on 1,000 official statements. She had no language for this. "Tell them thank you," she finally said. "Tell them I'll be out of this bed in 2 weeks. Tell them I'll be out of this bed in 2 weeks. Tell them." She exhaled. "Tell them the dog is fine." Patrice laughed, a short, wet sound. "I'll tell them." The door opened and Joseph Renner came in. He was in a wheelchair, pale under his tan, moving with the careful dignity of a man who had not yet gotten clearance to be out of bed and didn't particularly care. Kodiak woke at the sound of the wheels. He was on his feet in an instant, tail going, pressing against the wheel of the chair, against Renner's hand, against his legs. Renner ran both hands over the dog's head and back with the focused gratitude of someone taking inventory of something they had almost lost. Then he looked at Claire. She looked back at him. They were two people who had both spent the better part of their adult lives in harm's way, both fluent in the language of controlled understatement, both constitutionally resistant to the kind of moment that this actually was, so they let it be what it was for a second without either of them having to name it. "I hear you're a sergeant," Renner said finally. "Was," Claire said. "Medical. My kind of people." He looked down at Kodiak, then back at her. "He doesn't accept people easily." "I noticed. He stayed with you through the night." "I know." Renner was quiet for a moment. "The man who did this is in custody?" he said. "He's not going to be a problem." "I heard." Another silence. Outside, somewhere below, the crowd in the lot stood in the cold. "I don't know how to—" Renner stopped. He started again. "What you did was not nothing." "I know that too," Claire said. "Good." He leaned forward slightly in the wheelchair. "Then you understand that we don't walk away from a debt like this, not where I come from." "I didn't do it for a debt." "No, that's exactly why." He looked at Kodiak, who had settled his chin on the edge of Claire's mattress and was watching her with the calm, unwavering attention of an animal who had made a permanent decision. "You did it because it was right. That's the only reason we're standing outside your window." Claire looked at the window, at the winter light, at the crowd below that had been standing in the cold for 5 hours simply because they had decided she was worth standing for. She had treated broken bodies for 12 years. She had been shot at and rocketed and once, briefly, captured and released with a bruised rib and a new definition of the word patience. She had come home from 2 wars and found that the hardest part was not the wars but the coming home. The long, quiet work of learning how to live inside an ordinary life with an extraordinary amount of history pressing against the inside of your chest. She had not expected, in the parking structure of a hospital in North Carolina at midnight on a Tuesday, to find her way back to the thing that had made her go into service in the first place. The thing that said, there are people worth fighting for, and when you see the moment, you don't calculate, you move. She had moved. She was here. Kodiak's tail thumped once against the floor. The people below kept standing. She reached out and put her hand on the dog's head and felt him lean into it with the whole steady weight of his trust, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, Claire Novak felt something in herself go quiet in the best possible way, not empty, not numb, but still, like a thing that has finally found the place it was meant to rest. I keep thinking about the moment Claire let go of the lead. Not the stabbing, not the surgery, not the 231 people standing in the cold outside a hospital window. I keep thinking about that 1 second when she unclipped the lead from her wrist, said a word she wasn't even sure would work, and trusted the dog to do what she no longer could. That's the moment that gets me. Because she was already bleeding. She already knew she was going down, and she still made a choice. That's not instinct. That's character. And character like that doesn't come from nowhere. It's built, slowly, out of 1,000 smaller decisions that nobody sees. Claire spent 12 years making those decisions, showing up early to cover a colleague, taking a dog nobody asked her to take, standing between a knife and an animal that wasn't hers because the alternative, doing nothing, walking away, calculating the cost, simply wasn't available to her, not because she was reckless, because she had spent a long time developing the kind of moral clarity that makes certain choices feel less like choices and more like facts. This is what you do. So she did it. What I find myself returning to is how much of what happened that night was the result of who Claire already was before the knife came out. The 4 blades didn't reveal her character. They confirmed it, and Renner's phone calls, and Corwin's network, and the 200 people in the parking lot at 7 in the morning. None of that was random either. It was the downstream consequence of a life lived in a particular direction. People who show up for others tend to have others show up for them, not as a transaction, not as a reward, but because the same qualities that made Claire cover that dog are the same qualities that make people worth protecting. There's something in that I think about a lot. The idea that how we act in the small moments, whether we stay late, whether we take the harder right over the easier wrong, whether we extend trust to a frightened animal in a parking garage when nobody is watching, is actually the same thing as how we act when it matters most. It's not separate, it's practice, and Claire had been practicing for a long time. The intelligence she brought to that situation, reading the dog, reading the attacker, understanding in a fraction of a second what was possible and what wasn't, that didn't come from nowhere either. It came from years of learning how to think clearly under pressure, how to triage what's fixable and what isn't, how to act on incomplete information without freezing. She knew her body was failing. She made the best decision available anyway. And then there's the part where she just held on. Through the surgery, through the flat line, through 31 seconds of nothing, and the long, brutal climb back. That's not courage in the dramatic sense. That's something quieter and harder. The refusal to stop when stopping would be so much easier. The willingness to keep going when the only reason to keep going is that you're still here and there's still something worth doing. Kodiak was asleep on the floor when she woke up. He'd been there all night. He wasn't guarding her. He was just there. Because that's what you do for someone who went down for you. I think that's the whole story, really. In the end, we become the people who show up for us, and the only way to have people like that in your life is to be that kind of person first. Claire was. She is.